When people think about the Crusades, they usually picture battles, sieges, and knights in armor. But the way the major Crusader kings actually died tells a much more human story. Some were worn down by illness, some died after years of constant campaigning, and some met surprisingly ordinary ends for rulers of such violent times. In this video, we are going through the deaths of the most important Crusader kings, one by one, and looking at what each death reveals about medieval warfare, royal power, and life in the Crusader states. Number 1. Baldwin I. Baldwin I was the first crowned king of Jerusalem, and that matters because he set the pattern for what a Crusader king was supposed to be. He was not just a noble who happened to hold the city. He was a battlefield leader, a hard rider, and a ruler who spent most of his reign turning a fragile conquest into something that could actually survive. When he took the crown in late 1100, the kingdom was still little more than a chain of dangerous positions. The Crusaders held Jerusalem, but roads were unsafe, the coast was only partly controlled, and every campaign depended on whether knights, foot soldiers, and pack animals could move fast enough before heat, hunger, or enemy armies broke them. Baldwin understood that kind of warfare very well. He pushed hard for coastal ports, seized important cities, and helped build the military structure that later kings would depend on. In simple terms, he gave the Crusader state a spine. That is why his death matters so much. Baldwin did not die in a grand final battle with banners flying. He died the way many medieval rulers actually died, worn down by campaign life. In the spring of 1118, he was on campaign in Egypt, still trying to pressure the Fatimids and secure the southern frontier. By that point, he had been fighting for decades. He was already an older king by the standards of the time, and he was still the kind of ruler who insisted on staying with the army. During the expedition, he became gravely ill. The exact medical cause is still uncertain. Some later accounts connect it to an old internal wound, while others point more generally to the brutal physical strain of campaigning in desert conditions. Either way, the result was the same. He became too weak to ride and had to be carried back toward Jerusalem. He never made it. He died at Al-Arish on April 2nd, 1118. That detail tells you a lot about Crusader kingship. Medieval warfare was not only about sword blows and cavalry charges. It was also about distance, climate, infection, old injuries, and the fact that rulers were expected to stay physically present with the army. A king could survive sieges and ambushes for years, then be finished off by the accumulated cost of campaigning. Baldwin's death came far from the royal center he had worked so hard to strengthen. In a sense, he died exactly where a Crusader king was always most exposed, out on the edge, in motion, with the army. Even in death, the logistics of the age showed themselves. His body had to be preserved and taken back for burial in Jerusalem, which reminds you how difficult even the journey home could be in that world. The political effect was immediate, but it was also more stable than many later successions. Baldwin died without a direct heir, yet the kingdom did not collapse at once. That was partly because he had already built enough structure to allow a transfer of power. The crown passed to his cousin, Baldwin II, and the state continued. So when people talk about Crusader kings dying violently, Baldwin I is a good reminder that the job itself was violent enough, even when the final moment was illness on campaign, rather than death in battle. He had spent his life turning conquest into government, and then he died doing the same kind of work that had defined his reign, trying to hold the frontier through movement, pressure, and force. Number 2. Baldwin II. Baldwin II stepped into a kingdom that still depended on aggressive leadership, but his background gave him a slightly different edge. Before becoming king, he had ruled Edessa, one of the most exposed Crusader states, so he already knew what it meant to survive on a frontier where every march could become a disaster. He also knew captivity from personal experience. Earlier in his career, he had been captured by the Seljuks and later fought his way back into his own territory. That kind of life shaped the way he ruled. He was less like a founder and more like a hardened frontier commander who understood that the kingdom could survive only by combining castles, local alliances, and the growing role of the military orders. Under his reign, the Crusader position was reinforced, and he supported the religious military orders that would become central to Crusader warfare. Knights were still crucial, but by this point, the kingdom also needed institutions that could garrison fortresses, escort pilgrims, and keep trained men in the field even when ordinary feudal service was not enough. His reign also shows that Crusader kings were never ruling from a safe palace in the way people sometimes imagine. Baldwin spent large parts of his time dealing with threats beyond Jerusalem itself, especially in the north. He was even captured again while king, and the kingdom had to function while its ruler was in enemy hands. Yet he came back, resumed command, and kept the state moving. He also arranged one of the most important marriages in the kingdom's history by marrying his daughter Melisande to Fulk of Anjou, laying out a succession plan before his death. In other words, Baldwin II understood that a medieval ruler had to fight with the sword and plan with the family line at the same time. When death finally came, it was not sudden battlefield drama. It was the slow closing of a career spent under pressure. After campaigning in Antioch and dealing with northern affairs, he fell seriously ill. Medieval accounts describe him making arrangements for the succession while clearly aware that the end was near. He returned to Jerusalem, took monastic vows shortly before death, and died there in August 1131. That scene fits a very medieval pattern. A king who had spent his life in war tried at the end to die in a state of spiritual preparation. The man who had fought Turks, handled hostage crises, and navigated fragile alliances ended his life not under a helmet, but near the Holy Sepulchre, making sure the kingdom passed on in an orderly way. And that is really the key to Baldwin II's death. It marked the end of one of the last rulers who truly belonged to the first generation of Crusaders, the men who had come east in the era of the First Crusade itself. By the time he died, the kingdom was no longer an improvised conquest. It was a settled frontier state with its own aristocracy, castles, military orders, and succession politics. His death closed one chapter and opened another, because now the crown would pass not to one of the old conquering cousins, but to a new dynasty through Melisande and Fulk. So Baldwin II died of illness, but the significance of that death was bigger than the medical cause. It marked the moment when the original crusading generation was fading out, and a more established, but also more complicated Crusader monarchy was taking shape. Number 3. Fulk. Fulk came from Western Europe as a major noble, Count of Anjou, and that already made him different from the earlier kings. Baldwin I and Baldwin II had been frontier men of the First Crusade. Fulk was brought in through marriage and succession planning, which tells you something about how the kingdom had changed. By the time he took power in 1131, Jerusalem was no longer just surviving week to week.
It had become important enough that its royal succession could attract one of the biggest nobles in France. Even so, the kingdom he inherited was anything but calm. There were disputes inside the ruling family, arguments over influence, pressure from Antioch and Damascus, and the growing danger posed by powerful Muslim rulers like Zengi.
Fulk ruled in a world where Crusader kings had to do two things at once: fight external enemies and keep their own nobles from breaking the kingdom from inside. That internal pressure is a big part of his story. His marriage to Melisande was politically necessary, but it was never a simple arrangement where the incoming husband could just dominate the throne. Melisande had her own legitimacy as the daughter of Baldwin II, and the ruling class of Jerusalem knew it. So, Fulk's reign involved balancing his authority with hers while also defending the kingdom. Militarily, he focused more on fortifying and stabilizing than on reckless expansion. That was sensible. The age of easy Crusader gains was over. Castles, garrisons, and defensive depth mattered more now. This is where the image of medieval kingship gets interesting, because a Crusader king was not only a mounted knight in armor. He was also a manager of stone, labor, roads, wells, and supply points. Frontier defense was physical and architectural as much as it was heroic. Then came one of the most famous accidental royal deaths of the Crusader era. In November 1143, while near Acre, Fulk was out hunting. Hunting in the Middle Ages was not a harmless hobby in the modern sense. For kings, it was training, display, risk, and status all at once. A mounted aristocrat hunted because it kept the body sharp for war and also showed rank. But it was dangerous. Fulk's horse stumbled during the hunt and threw him, and the injury proved fatal soon afterward.
That means one of the major kings of Crusader Jerusalem was not killed by a great enemy commander, not struck down in a siege, not murdered by rebels, but brought down by the same riding culture that shaped elite medieval life. There is something revealing in that. Crusader kings lived in a military society where skill on horseback mattered every day, whether in battle, patrol, or the hunt. The line between training for war and fatal accident was thin. Fulk's death also mattered because it came at a delicate moment. His son, Baldwin III, was still young, and Melisande was more than capable of defending her own position. So the result was not just grief, but a new power arrangement. His accidental death opened the way for a shared rule that would shape the next phase of the kingdom. In other words, Fulk died in a way that looks random, but the consequences were highly political. One stumble in a hunt changed who would control Jerusalem, how the regency would work, and how the kingdom would respond to the mounting pressure of the mid-12th century. Number 4. Baldwin III. Baldwin III inherited a throne, but not full control. After Fulk's death, he and his mother Melisande ruled together, which meant the kingdom had authority at the top, but also tension built into that authority from the start. For years, Baldwin had to grow from a young king in name into an actual commander and decision-maker. That is one reason he became so highly respected. He did not simply receive power. He had to take it in stages, first by surviving the political structure around him, and then by proving himself militarily. This was the period when the Crusader states were under pressure from stronger and more coordinated enemies, and when Western help was far less reliable than people often assume. The Second Crusade came east, but it failed badly. So Baldwin's generation could not just wait for Europe to rescue it. It had to fight with what it already had. Once Baldwin took sole rule, he showed real ability. He dealt with internal conflict, kept influence in the northern Crusader states, and won one of the kingdom's last major territorial gains by capturing Ascalon in 1153. That was a serious achievement. Ascalon had been a major Fatimid base and a long-standing threat on the southern flank. Taking it improved the strategic map, secured part of the coast, and showed that Jerusalem still had offensive power. At the same time, Baldwin ruled during a turning point.
Even when the Crusaders won locally, larger pressure was building around them. Damascus fell under the control of Nur al-Din, and the Muslim world was becoming more politically unified. So, Baldwin's reign often looks like the last strong, balanced phase before the strategic tide began moving harder against the kingdom. That is what makes his death feel so consequential. Baldwin III died young, at only 34, in Beirut on February 10, 1163. Medieval sources and later historians do not give one perfectly certain story for the cause. The basic fact is that he died after an illness. Some later reports raised suspicions that poison might have been involved, especially because he fell ill after taking medicine from a physician in Antioch. But that was never firmly proven, and the safer conclusion is that he died suddenly under circumstances that were worrying enough to generate rumor. In medieval courts, rumor was almost automatic when a healthy, fighting king died before his time. People looked for plots because early death at the top always changed everything. And everything did change. Baldwin had no children, so the crown passed to his brother, Amalric. That transfer mattered because Baldwin's reign had represented competence, personal authority, and a certain military steadiness. His death cut that short. It also reminds you that Crusader kings were vulnerable not only in battle, but in travel, medicine, and the basic uncertainty of medieval health.
A ruler could campaign, negotiate with Byzantium, command sieges, and still be brought down by disease, or by treatment that may have done more harm than good. For a kingdom like Jerusalem, which depended so heavily on the personality and physical presence of its king, that kind of sudden loss was a strategic event. Baldwin III did not die in a glorious last charge. He died before his project was finished. And that unfinished quality is part of why chroniclers remembered him so strongly. Number 5. Amalric I. Amalric I stepped onto the throne in 1163, after Baldwin III's early death. And from the start, his reign had a harder edge. Where Baldwin is often remembered as the ideal king, Amalric comes across as the intensely practical one, a ruler focused on law, authority, and big strategic moves. He inherited a kingdom that was still viable, but the room for error was shrinking. By this stage, the central military question was becoming Egypt. Whoever controlled Egypt could change the balance of the entire Eastern Mediterranean. If Jerusalem could dominate or divide Egypt, the Crusader kingdom might stay strong. If a rival power united Egypt with Syria, the kingdom would be trapped between two fronts. Amalric saw that clearly, which is why so much of his reign was tied to repeated interventions in Egyptian politics and warfare. This is where the story becomes very medieval, in the broadest sense. Because it is not just about battles. It is about sea power, alliances, law, tribute, and dynastic legitimacy. Amalric even had to secure his accession by annulling his marriage to Agnes of Courtenay, under pressure from the political elite, though their children remained legitimate. That detail alone shows how vulnerable succession could be. At the same time, he pursued military campaigns into Egypt and worked with the Byzantine Emperor Manuel I in one of the most ambitious strategic partnerships the Crusader kingdom ever had. The idea was big:
stop Muslim unity by breaking the struggle over Egypt in Jerusalem's favor. In theory, that could have changed the whole future of the Crusader states. In practice, the campaigns were difficult, expensive, and not decisive enough. Still, Amalric was no weak king. He defended the rights of vassals, tried to strengthen royal government, and understood that the kingdom needed more than heroic charges by knights. It needed administration and political discipline. But the larger problem was time. While Amalric was trying to master Egypt, forces were converging around him. Nur al-Din remained dangerous, and the rise of men like Shirkuh and then Saladin would soon transform the strategic picture completely. Amalric was fighting against the clock as much as against any single enemy commander. His death came in 1174, exactly when timing mattered most. After Nur al-Din died in May of that year, Amalric saw an opportunity to move again and exploit the temporary confusion in Syria. Instead, on the return journey, he fell ill with dysentery. He reached Jerusalem. Physicians tried to save him, and he died on July 11th, 1174, at only 38. That was not an unusual medieval killer at all. Dysentery, fever, contaminated water, and camp disease could destroy armies and kings as efficiently as blades. The image of medieval war often focuses on armored cavalry, but sanitation and disease were just as decisive. Men marched, camped, sweated, shared water sources, and lived among animals. A successful commander could survive battles and still lose to the invisible side of campaign life. Amalric's death had enormous consequences because it passed the crown to his son Baldwin IV, who was still a boy and already suffering from leprosy. So the death itself was tragic, but what followed was even more important. With Amalric gone, the kingdom lost an adult ruler at the exact moment when larger regional unification was becoming a mortal danger.
His reign had been a serious attempt to solve the Egypt problem before it was too late. He died before he could solve it, and that unfinished struggle would define everything that came next. Number 6. Baldwin IV. Baldwin IV is the most famous Crusader king today, and for obvious reasons. He ruled while suffering from leprosy, he faced Saladin, and he became one of those figures whose real life already sounds dramatic enough without any embellishment. But what makes his story important is not just the disease. It is the fact that he remained politically and militarily relevant for years after the diagnosis. He became king in 1174 as a teenager, when the kingdom badly needed adult stability, and instead it got a young ruler whose health would steadily decline in public view. That changed everything about how power worked. Regents became important. Court factions grew sharper. Questions about succession became constant. And every decision had to be made with one fact hanging over the kingdom. The king could not found a stable future line of his own. Even so, Baldwin IV was not a passive figure. He fought, directed campaigns, and remained central to the kingdom's morale. He is strongly associated with the victory at Montgisard in 1177, one of the most famous Crusader wins against Saladin. Over time, though, the illness advanced. Leprosy, in his case, gradually reduced his mobility, damaged his body, and forced more and more of royal activity into the hands of deputies and allies. By the early 1180s, he could no longer function like a normal mounted ruler. Contemporary evidence suggests that he eventually became unable to walk without support, lost the use of his hands, and went blind. That matters because medieval kingship was deeply physical. A king was expected to ride, review troops, lead processions, hear petitions, and appear in person. Baldwin kept doing what he could for as long as he could, but his body was slowly making ordinary kingship impossible. His final years were dominated by succession planning. Since he could not expect children, he had to think constantly about who would rule after him. That led to one of the biggest political problems in Crusader history, whether power should pass through his sister Sibylla and her husband Guy of Lusignan, or whether other arrangements could keep the kingdom in steadier hands. Baldwin tried different solutions,
including having his young nephew crowned during his own lifetime. That was not ceremonial theater. It was a desperate attempt to control the future before death took the choice away from him. In a kingdom under growing pressure from Saladin, succession was not just a family issue. It was a military survival issue. Baldwin IV died in Jerusalem in the spring of 1185 after years of progressive decline from leprosy. There was no mystery about the broader cause. This was the long endpoint of a disease everyone around him had watched advance. What made it powerful was the contrast between his failing body and the kingdom's continuing dependence on him. Even when he had become blind and immobile, his presence still held factions together better than the alternatives did. So when he died, the kingdom did not just lose a king. It lost the one person who had enough legitimacy to keep rival groups from tearing the succession apart too quickly. That is why his death feels like a hinge in Crusader history. He did not die in battle, but once he was gone, the road to the disaster of 1187 became much easier to imagine. The man known as the Leper King died of the disease that had shaped his reign, and the political vacuum after him was almost as important as the illness itself. Number 7. Baldwin V.
Baldwin V is often treated as a minor figure because he was a child king. But his short life is one of the clearest examples of how fragile Crusader politics had become by the mid-1180s. He was the nephew and chosen successor of Baldwin IV, crowned while still a little boy in an effort to block a more chaotic succession later on. On paper, that was a smart move. If the child was already recognized, then rival claims might be contained and the kingdom could buy time. In reality, it meant the entire state was being balanced on the health and survival of a single young child in one of the most dangerous political environments in the medieval world. That should tell you how narrow the kingdom's options had become. Baldwin IV could no longer rule effectively in person forever. The adults around him did not trust each other enough to agree easily on the next full ruler. So the answer became a child under regency. Raymond of Tripoli played a major role in the government during this period, while other powerful figures watched closely. Every faction understood that if Baldwin V lived, one political future was possible. If he died, a different and far more explosive struggle would begin immediately. In other words, the health of one boy stood between the kingdom and a full succession crisis. And then, that is exactly what happened. Baldwin V died at Acre in 1186, probably around the age of 8 or 9. The exact cause is not known. That is one of the key facts here. Unlike Baldwin IV, whose illness was public and undeniable, Baldwin V disappears into uncertainty. Later accusations and rumors of poisoning appeared, because of course they did. Medieval courts produced suspicion almost automatically when a child king died at the center of a succession battle. Some later writers blamed one faction, others blamed another, but no solid proof exists. The safest conclusion is that he died of unknown causes after a short and politically explosive reign. That uncertainty is actually part of the story's power. A child king's death did not need to be murder to be catastrophic. In a medieval setting, children were vulnerable to disease all the time. A brief illness could end a life before anyone had time to understand what was happening. The Crusader kingdom was not exempt from ordinary medieval mortality just because its rulers wore crowns and armor. In fact, the higher the stakes, the more destructive an ordinary illness could become. Baldwin V's death is a perfect example. Even if no plot was involved, the result was still massive.
The careful succession management attempted by Baldwin IV collapsed almost at once. After the boy's death, the political struggle everyone had feared finally erupted. Sibylla moved quickly, claimed the crown, and then elevated Guy of Lusignan as king. That shift mattered enormously because many nobles distrusted Guy's leadership and judgment, especially at a time when Saladin was growing stronger and the kingdom needed unity more than ever. So Baldwin V did not live long enough to make decisions, command armies, or leave a military record. But his death changed the fate of the kingdom as surely as any battle. It removed the last controlled option and opened the door to the final pre-Hattin succession settlement. Sometimes in medieval history, the most important death is not the death of the strongest warrior, but the death of the one fragile figure holding a broken political balance together. Number 8. Guy of Lusignan. Guy of Lusignan is the ruler most people connect with the fall of Jerusalem, and whether that reputation is fully fair or not, he is impossible to separate from the crisis that followed Baldwin V's death.
He became king through his wife, Sibylla, and from the beginning his legitimacy was contested by important nobles who doubted both his experience and his judgment. That was a terrible setup for a kingdom facing Saladin. Crusader warfare at this stage demanded discipline, coordination, supply control, and the ability to keep divided lords moving in the same direction. What Guy inherited instead was mistrust at the top and a strategic situation that could punish one bad decision with permanent consequences. The decision everyone remembers is the march that led to the Battle of Hattin in 1187. Saladin's forces drew the Crusader army into a punishing movement across hot, dry ground, away from reliable water. This is one of the classic lessons of medieval warfare in the Holy Land. Armor, courage, and knightly shock power all mattered, but so did terrain, thirst, timing, and logistics. By the time the army reached Hattin, it was in terrible condition. Saladin destroyed it. Guy was captured, and the kingdom's field army was effectively broken. After that, Jerusalem itself fell later that same year. So when people think of Guy, they think of catastrophic defeat. And that part is justified. His reign became tied to the most devastating military collapse the First Kingdom of Jerusalem ever suffered. But Guy did not die at Hattin. That is an important correction. He survived the disaster, spent time in captivity, and was eventually released. He tried to remain politically relevant during the struggle that followed, especially during the Third Crusade and the Siege of Acre. After Sibylla died in 1190, his claim to Jerusalem weakened sharply, and the crown became the object of another bitter contest. In the end, he lost the kingship, but he was compensated with Cyprus, where he ruled for a short time. That ending is almost ironic. The man forever remembered as the king who lost Jerusalem did not meet a dramatic battlefield death in the Holy Land. He outlived the great defeat and spent his last years building a new base of rule elsewhere. Guy died in 1194 after ruling Cyprus for about 2 years. The sources do not preserve a famous heroic end, and there is no major last stand attached to his name. In practical terms, he died away from the battlefield after the real political fight over Jerusalem was already lost. That quiet ending is part of why his story lingers. Baldwin I died on campaign. Fulk died in a riding accident. Baldwin IV died after a long public illness. Guy, the king most associated with the kingdom's collapse, died later and elsewhere, with none of the cinematic finality people might expect. By then, Jerusalem was gone. Hattin had already defined his memory, and the center of Lusignan power was shifting to Cyprus. So in the end, Guy of Lusignan's death
was not the most dramatic Crusader royal death, but it may be the most revealing. It shows how history remembers rulers less for the medical cause of death than for the moment their reign came to symbolize. Guy died in 1194, but in terms of reputation, his story had already been fixed years earlier on the field of Hattin. The man lived on. The kingship he represented did not.